part of the Children of Abraham. I'm representing Beth Shalom. So welcome to Beth Shalom, and shortly I will be asking our President to do the official welcome. So tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Salam alaikum, shalom, and greetings to you all. It's wonderful to have so many people here. Just some housekeeping first. Our bathrooms are through the door over there, behind you. And in the case of fire, leave by the nearest exit. So we have the doors there, and there is a door behind us. When you leave tonight, someone will have to let you out through our gate. Just as it was a bit of a mission getting in, it's a mission getting out. So if you need to go earlier, just make sure you find a Beth Shalom person who can let you out. So I'd like to invite Olga Benson, our President, to say a deep welcome.
I'm delighted to welcome you all here to this event, both those of you who are here in person and people who are here virtually. And this event is part of the Children of Abraham initiative, which is an initiative of Abrahamic religions, it's an Abrahamic religions interfaith initiative formed by the Pearl of Islands Foundation, Holy Trinity Cathedral, and the Beth Shalom Progressive Synagogue, in order to promote mutual understanding, cooperation, and proactive inclusion in all we stand for in our religions. A huge, huge thank you for all the work that the organisers have put in to make today's session happen. And I'd also like to publicly acknowledge Yasser, who's worked so hard to make this and all the other joint events such a success. I know that you will be sorely missed, but we wish you all the best in your new role with Ethnic Affairs. So thank you, Yasser. We all belong to religions that believe that the start of creation was the creation of heaven and earth, and that mankind was created to be the curator of that, or the custodian of that creation. We've also watched as mankind has failed in that custodial role. Today's session speaks to that desire that we share for religion to extend its focus to encompass both human and ecological concerns. I'd like to thank and welcome our presenters. Amr Saleh, who is the Auckland City Hospital Imam, Dr Emily Colgan, who's Senior Lecturer at the Trinity Theological College, and Debbie Miller, who's the educator here at Beth Shalom. Thank you all, and we're looking forward to your presentations. Thank you.
Just before we begin, I would just like to talk to you a little bit about Kristallnacht, because Kristallnacht, it is the 82nd anniversary today. It took place in Germany, November 9th and 10th, 1938. It became known as the Night of Broken Glass from all the shattered glass in the streets. The Nazis vandalized and desecrated synagogues. They destroyed Jewish houses, Jewish businesses. They broke the shop windows and caused great devastation. And it was really bad in Berlin, but it was throughout Germany, but it was particularly bad in Berlin, where my family lived. Some 30,000 men were rounded up throughout Germany and taken to concentration camps. This was the first time the Nazis had made massive arrests of Jews, specifically because they were Jews, for no cause. And it was after this event that the Nazis enacted many of the anti-Jewish laws and edicts. My grandfather was one of those Jewish men arrested and imprisoned in Sachsenhausen concentration camp just out of Berlin. He was already in his 60s and he had a heart condition. My father's mother pleaded with the Nazis to release him, but to no avail. How brave she was to even try. On this occasion, my grandfather did come home unharmed, but many others died from the brutality or were left broken people from the experience. So tonight, we pause to remember the night of broken glass, Kristallnacht. Now I've left my notes. I would now like to invite Emily Colgan, our first speaker. Dr Emily Colgan is Senior Lecturer in Biblical Studies at Trinity Theological College, and her research focuses on the relationship between the Bible and contemporary social imaginaries, asking about the degree to which ideologies contained within biblical texts continue to inform communities in the present. Emily is particularly interested in ecological representations in the Bible, as well as depictions of gender and violence. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I don't know that this is on.
Yes, it is, I think.
You good? Okay, excellent. Kia ora. And kia ora mai tātou, e mihi nui ana kia koutou katoa. Shalom, Erev Tov to my Jewish brothers and sisters. Assalamu alaikum to my Muslim brothers and sisters. It is such a privilege to be here tonight, and thank you so much for the invitation to speak. A couple of weeks ago, I was in Christchurch. Thank you. For the Antarctic Ice Week. And I was part of a panel speaking on this theme. Christchurch is one of only 5 gateway cities to Antarctica, and so each year they run a week of events focusing on Antarctica and the massively important role it plays in global climate patterns. It was a pretty amazing panel to be on that included the head of Antarctic Scientific Research in New Zealand, the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor, and it's fair to say that I was completely out of my depth, at least scientifically speaking. But probably the biggest takeaway from that panel for me was this idea that scientific fact by itself is not enough to motivate people to action. The shared messages coming from these preeminent scientists was the realization that it's not enough to keep ramming terrifying scientific fact after terrifying scientific fact down people's throats. The question they all kept coming back to was, how do we get people to care enough to change? And for me, this is a really crucial question, because for more than 50 years now, scientific leaders have been warning us that climate change is real, that it's already causing irrevocable damage to the planet. And yet, despite climate change being acknowledged as among the most critical issues faced by our planet, this unprecedented threat to Earth has failed to galvanise humanity, and questions remain as to whether the political will exists to address the situation quickly and effectively. Scientific fact alone, it seems, is not enough to counter what Thomas Berry calls the deep cultural pathology that enables humanity to cause such damage without thought of long-term consequence. Berry argues that these warnings must also find a degree of coherence with the religious and philosophical foundations that underlie the way in which human communities perceive themselves and their relationship to the surrounding environment. Ooh, there was a quote there. Sorry about that. It's all good. We can move to the next slide. Cool. And this is where I think faith communities come into it. Globally, over 5.5 billion people identify as belonging to a religious tradition or a faith community. Of that 5.5 billion, 2.3 billion are Christian, 1.9 billion are Muslim, and 14.7 million are Jewish. That's a serious amount of people power. That's a serious amount of pull power. Imagine if you could mobilize even half that number of people for radical climate action in the world. Now, I realize I'm probably preaching to the converted, but I think faith communities need to get serious, like life or death serious, about our role and responsibility in this climate crisis. Because, because as Christian theologian Rosemary Radford Ruether argues, the vast majority of religious people in the world are far more likely to be persuaded of an ecological consciousness if they see that it grows from the soil in which they are planted. So, all this is just a very long-winded way of saying that faith communities have a crucial role to play alongside scientists, policymakers, and government leaders. One of the things I'm really interested in exploring is how Christian communities might respond positively to the climate crisis. And this, of course, involves critical reflection on our traditions, but also searching these traditions to seek more ecologically life-giving insights. Over the past 50 years or so, I'm not ready for that yet, it's all good. Oh no, go back. I'll give you the nod. Cool, thank you. Over the past 50 years or so, Christians have been strongly criticized for their attitude towards the environment. In particular, the way Christians have used biblical texts to enable, justify, legitimize ecological destruction. I thought we might explore this a little bit in a little bit more depth with a couple of familiar texts from the book of Genesis. But I just need to be very clear, of course, at the outset, that these are interpretations as they appear from within the Christian tradition. Obviously, they are interpreted and understood in different ways in other faith traditions. One of the projects I've been involved in for a number of years now is called the Earth Bible Project. Now, the Earth Bible Project provides one way of reading the Bible from a Christian perspective in the context of ecological degradation. This reading strategy is unique within Christianity in that it requires a radical reorientation to the biblical text. Earth is placed at the center of the interpretation, and questions are asked of Earth's presence in the text. So, in ecological interpretation, Earth is not a theme for analysis. Earth is autonomous. It is an agent in its own right, a subject or a character within the text. This approach emphasizes reflection with Earth and attempts to perceive reality from Earth's perspective. This way of reading the Bible involves a three-step process to interpret the text. The three steps are suspicion, identification, and retrieval. So the first task is that of suspicion. When approaching a text that relates to Earth or any part of the Earth community, interpreters may suspect that the Christian history of interpretation has been anthropocentric, regarding the rest of the Earth community and the Earth itself as inferior creatures. That is, biblical interpretation within Christianity has been primarily interested in the relationship between God and humanity. And so some of the questions that this step involves asking include, where is the earth in this text? How is the earth presented in this text? How do other characters engage with the earth in this text? And are there texts in the Bible where the voices of earth and earth's community are present but have been ignored because of the mindset of past interpreters? The next step is the step of identification. Identification is described as coming to terms with one's deep ecological connections, where, as an interpreter or as a reader, we are able to reposition ourselves as self-consciously part of the earth. And so when we read biblical texts, we're mindful that we read as creatures of earth, as members of the earth community, and in solidarity with earth. Read from the perspective of an interconnected member of this community, a new level of sensitivity emerges. We're sensitive to the experience of the earth in the text. This stage is about becoming an advocate for the earth, representing, arguing for, and supporting the presence of this character within the biblical text. And so we ask, how might the earth experience the events described in the text? The final task of retrieval acknowledges that the earth is already speaking and acting within a biblical text. This process listens to and learns from the silenced or ignored voice of the earth. This step is about hearing earth as a character communicating its story. This voice need not correspond to the language of human words associated with human voices. And so we ask, how might we retrieve the experience of earth that has been suffocated by human readers who focus on human interests? And this step is about articulating this communication. So, how might we go about doing an ecological reading of a biblical text? I want to have a look at the creation texts in Genesis because, as a number of eco-theologians have argued, Genesis 1 at least has played a hugely significant role in how Christians perceive themselves in relation to the earth and the other than human community. So, let's have a look at this text. Initially at least, earth is a partner in the creation process. Earth's soil brings forth all kinds of vegetation. Animals emerge from the ground. In verses 11, 12, and 24. The sea brings forth life in its oceans. All creatures have a common kinship that derives from earth. And God sees that it is good. God affirms, God values, and celebrates the birth of earth. But in verses 26 to 28, we see that humans are made a little bit differently. They're made in the image of God and given the mandate to dominate, fill, and subdue the earth. We read, God blessed them and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. Christian interpreters have typically understood this text as placing humans at the pinnacle of creation, thus diminishing the value of the other than human community. Indeed, not only has Christian interpretation affirmed this text as establishing human beings as master over the environment, but it has also been claimed that this text depicts as God's will the exploitation of nature to serve human interests. Contemporary eco-theologians suggest that this Christian interpretation of the world and the absolute belief in human superiority has led to behaviour that has been ecologically devastating. In traditional Christian interpretation, humans are not part of the earth in any way. We are made in the image of God and given the mandate to dominate, fill, and subdue the earth. Elsewhere in the Bible, this word dominion is used to describe what kings and taskmasters do. They dominate their subjects and their enemies. The word subdue is used elsewhere to mean crush underfoot and to subjugate. So these are words that have violent overtones, and traditionally, Christian interpreters have understood the relationship between humanity and earth as characterized by violence, hierarchy, and disconnection. So, are there other biblical texts that might help contribute to an alternative narrative for Christian communities, which try to make sense of our place and purpose in the world in a different way? And we don't have to look very far to find Genesis chapter 2. Typically, Christian interpreters of this text understand the main characters to be God, the man, the woman, and perhaps the snake, who comes a little bit later. But what about the earth? In verse 5, we learn that there is no vegetation on earth because there is no one to serve earth and nurture her. So, God takes some soil from earth and molds it into a human being. Here, humans are created from earth, for earth. God gives the human the task of completing what is missing at the beginning of the story. The human has the task of greening earth. Ooh. In verse 15 we read, Then the Lord God took the human and put him in the Garden of Eden to serve and preserve it. The first and most fundamental human work here is to serve and preserve earth. In the Bible, serving is what people did when they devoted their attention to a person or task. Members of the court, for example, served the king. Priests and worshippers served God. In verse 19, earth helps God to create the animals and birds. And there's kinship between these creatures and the human being. They both originate in the earth's fertile soil. Earth is their common ancestor, and God their creator. Within Genesis 2, then, humanity is part of a single unfolding reality. This text depicts an intimacy between God, humanity, and the whole earth community. Humanity is not separate from God or earth. There is a continuity of life. In this text, we are deeply connected to, and indeed utterly dependent on, both God and earth. Recognizing our connection with earth in this way carries with it strong ethical dimensions. To perceive ourselves as beings who depend upon others and upon whom others depend requires broadening our gaze to include genuine consideration of all living beings. And this is a huge shift from our current orientation within Christianity. I want to point out here that the image of relationship that we've drawn from Genesis 2 here does not intend to provide solutions to the intricate and complex issues specific to the climate crisis. Rather, this biblical vision and others found elsewhere within the biblical text provide Christian communities with a foundation for reconceiving the relationship between God, earth, and humanity from which these communities might then address the multiplicity of issues related to the ecological crisis. In emphasising connectedness, mutual relationality, service and subjectivity, this text provides an alternative to the human-centred outlook which is often implicit in Christian liturgies, worship, and our ideas about justice and morality. Set alongside the ever-increasing scientific discoveries that point towards interdependence and the continuity of all life, this text and others like it has the potential to act as a powerful resource for Christian communities in the ongoing endeavour to alleviate environmental degradation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily. That was a very original talk. It really stretched our thinking, for sure. Our next speaker, and excuse me if I don't say the name quite right, is Amr Saleh. And Amr is a student of religious studies with interest in interfaith dialogue, and he delivers the Friday sermons at the Auckland City Hospital and works as a data engineer for 2 degrees. Thank you. Over to you.
Hello, everyone. I'm really impressed. Thank you, Emily, for this very insightful and deep. Oh, it's not on?
Sorry, and that's for the camera. That's for the
Oh,
speakers.
No, we've got 2.
Oh, do we?
These are both ours. Yeah, have you got it on?
Yeah.
Is
Hello?
it green? No?
Why don't you just give us yours?
Yeah, and it should work now.
That's not good. Hello, everyone. I'm really impressed and honored to be here today talking with you, although it's very difficult after what Emily has done. The amount of research and the chronological order of explaining the biblical side and the research side, that was really impressive. Allow me to be very simple, very casual. Although at the same time, I'll just say what the Islamic narrative and the Islamic teachings around the environment along the line. But first of all, it's really personal that I want to share with you a story. I'm happy to be here today in a synagogue for the first time in my life. And I remember the time, my very few first weeks in New Zealand. And I wanted to pray the Friday prayer. And I went to Ponsonby Masjid, the mosque in Ponsonby in the city. And I couldn't find a place to park my car, so I asked a friend, and he said, just park over there, in the church over there. I was like, sorry? You guys park in this church? Is it something you do here? I'm new to the country, just tell me. And he said, yeah. Just go park over there. That's what we do. On Fridays, we park in the church. On Sunday, they park in the mosque. Easy. And yeah, that makes perfect sense. Yeah, that makes sense. But I have traveled quite a bit. I've seen other countries. But the level of tolerance that we have in New Zealand really is different. I made a lot of friends in the past few years I've been in New Zealand. A lot of times I see groups from the church coming to visit me in the prayer. And I get invited a lot to speak with Jewish groups and Christian groups. That's really impressive. And if you're born here, or you've lived here so long that you don't think this is really good, no, it is. So take a moment and just appreciate it. New Zealand is beautiful. And then the shocking events happened, 15th of March. I remember the ache it felt, just sleeping at night, and the ache of losing someone. It's really horrible. Almost everyone in this country has lost, the Muslim communities have lost a loved one, a family member, a friend. But the immense love what we've seen from the community on the very next day, that was also exceptional. I remember the visual. I went to Nautia Square, and I saw thousands of people. For the first time, I don't see this number of people in New Zealand. Thousands of people gathering on the very next day. I remember the speech from the rabbi. I remember the speech from the Christian community. I remember the visits the very next week to our mosque. Usually in my mosque, there's like 100 people, 200 max showing up. And that day, about 700 people. I couldn't cross to the spot where I give the speech from the amount of people, all just gathering to say, we are together. We are one. It's very special to see this happening in New Zealand. We're really far ahead of the world when it comes to tolerance. I just had to make this introduction. And I also have to mention that now, when I look back and think about the terrorist who did this attack, he wasn't religious. He wasn't following any religion. He mentioned in his, whatever he wrote, he said that he was not doing this for a religious reason. And what happens is, it's the same. It's the case with all terrorists. They don't follow the religion. Because it doesn't take you so long when you read and study a religion to find that peace and love is at the root of every single religion on this earth. But it's us that we can sometimes twist it to our favor, to our agenda, to implement corruption. And hatred and enmity, they happen when we don't know the other. Hatred happens when a person dehumanizes the other, when he thinks as if he's not fully human being, he's not equals. But the way to change this is to come and meet and listen to each other and talk and get to understand the perspective from here, from there, know how we think, know how we are deep down just the same. Just the same. In the Quran, God said, O people, O mankind, we have created you from a man and a woman. And then we have made you into nations and tribes in order to know one another. In order to know one another. If you think about it, all of us in this room, we share the same parents. Adam and Eve are our parents. We're literally family. And we're different nations and tribes in order to know one another. So I'm really grateful for the Pearl of Islands and for Yasser for putting this together, for getting us to know one another, to listen to the biblical narrative of how we should preserve Earth and the Islamic one and then the Jewish one. And in this matter, the first principle that highlights the relationship between the human being and Earth and the environment and nature is the trusteeship. In Arabic we call it Khalifa, which basically means guardian. God has made a human being the guardian of this planet. It's a trust. God has entrusted us to look after this earth. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, says, the world is beautiful. It is verdant, and verily God, the Exalted, has made you his steward in it. And he sees how you acquit yourself. If a believer plants a tree and then an animal comes passing by, eats from it, or a person or whoever, or a bird, he gets rewarded. It's as if he has done a charity because he has planted a tree and it's in favor of creatures in this world. And again, the essence boils down to harmony, to living in this world, knowing that you are entrusted of this world to prosper it. God dislikes corruption, all kinds of it, including environmental corruption, industrial pollution, environmental damage, all sorts of not fully caring of our environment. And do good as Allah has been good to you. In the Quran, Allah says, and do good as Allah has done good for you. And do not seek to cause corruption in this earth. Allah does not love those who corrupt. Islam talks about pollution and environment and corruption way before it was green and cool. In our mosques, we try to take steady steps to set an example for our community, for our people, to take one step further. We don't need the government to tell us don't use plastic, so we stop it. We just tend to take one step further. Let's try to do something good for the environment, even if the whole world is not. And I will tell you why near the end. But let me tell you a story, because the environment is not just the green nature and trees. It's also all there is, the ecosystem of animals and birds. And when it comes to dealing with different creatures, there are a set of rules. We can't kill an animal just like that, just haphazardly. You can't kill even an ant haphazardly. This is not allowed in Islam. You can't kill an ant. And there's a beautiful story with ants in the Quran. The Prophet Solomon was with his army, and they crossed by a valley of ants. And the Prophet Solomon, he knew the words of the animals and ants, so he could understand. And one of the ants talked to its people, saying, get in the valley, get in, stay away, so Solomon may crush you. And Solomon smiled, and he thanked God. He thanked God for the favor that he can understand ants, and that he can cross with his valley almost the entire earth without crushing the ants. One story happened with the Prophet Muhammad when they were traveling, and he found a pigeon looking for its sons. And the Prophet became angry, and he said, who took the sons of this pigeon? Turn it back to them. It's not simple. You just don't go around mess with animals because they don't have... No, they have feelings. They are nations like you. You can slaughter animals for the sake of eating, but not for the sake of fun. You can't use animals as targets to play or to shoot or to practice. You can do it for the sake of eating, but nothing else. And even if you do it for the sake of eating, you pay its respect. The Prophet says, if you are to slaughter an animal, then do it right. Do it wisely. Sharpen your knife and make it easy for the animal. One day the Prophet found someone who was slaughtering an animal, and he was sharpening the knife in front of the animal, and the animal was gazing at the knife. The Prophet says, can't you do that earlier? Do you want to kill the animal twice? And when it comes to eating, we don't just eat as full as we can. The Prophet says the worst container you can ever fill is your stomach. So we shouldn't be filling our stomachs. It's 3/3. Third for the food, third for the drinks, water, and third for air, empty. We don't get full. We're not supposed to be full. And imagine if we all apply this. If we don't waste the tons of food that we waste every single day, how would this world look like? How would the poverty look like? Eat and drink, but don't waste by excess. For Allah does not love the wasters. This is the Holy Quran. Quran also says, children of Adam, dress well when you are at worship, and eat and drink, but do not be extravagant. God does not like extravagant people. Even if you are rich, even if resources are there, we are commanded to use resources wisely. The Prophet says, do not waste water. Even if you were on the bank of a flowing river. To you, it's a river. I can just waste it. No. Don't waste water. In cleaning, in drink, don't waste water. But oftentimes, actually more often than not, people don't pay attention to all of that. This is just the theory. We come to the mosque, we listen to this, but in real life we eat as full as we can and we do all the bad things. But there are repercussions. The Quran says, corruption has spread on land and sea as a result of what people's hands have done, so that Allah may cause them to taste the consequences of some of their deeds, and perhaps they might return. We start to see the global warming, we start to see all the impact of our craziness. We just, for financial reasons, we don't care about the environment, but hey, it's coming back. And there's a story I want to sort of finish with. You may have heard this story before. It's a jungle that was on fire. And all the animals were just screaming and running and crazy, our home is being burned, what should we do, where should we go, and just screaming and running everywhere. And there was this little hummingbird that would fly all the way to the river, pick up some teeny tiny droplets of water in its mouth, and fly back to the forest and drops it. And flies again to the river, picks up some teeny tiny droplets of water and go back all the way to the fire and drops it. Animals were like, dude, what are you doing? Hummingbird, you're so small. You do nothing. And the bird would look at them and say, hey, I'm doing what I can. Basically, this is what we need to do. Regardless of the amount of corruption in this world, if you can only do what you can, that will be enough. Do it consistently until the final breath. The Prophet says, when the hour happens, and the hour means the final moment in this world, like this world is ending, it's collapsing. When the hour comes, and in the hand of one of you is this little seed, he is planting a new tree. It takes years to be something. And the world is finishing. This will never be a tree. It doesn't have time. The Prophet says, if you can plant it, then go plant it. My brothers, all we need to do is to do what we can, to be like the hummingbird, to do an action, to be good to people, to animals, to plants, to the environment, just to do the bit that we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amr. That was a good reflection, not only on the environment, but also on New Zealand. So thank you. Our last speaker is Debbie Miller, who is the educator for Beth Shalom, and she's held that position for the last 5 years. Microphone's here. She runs the Hebrew school for our children and also runs an adult education program which includes Hebrew language studies as well as Jewish studies. Debbie lived in Israel for 18 years and studied there. She's originally from the USA, is married with 4 children, and she's a keen activist for the environment, and we are very aware of that, all of us here who belong here. She keeps us on our toes, and she also ran a Jewish Sustainability Leadership Training Seminar a couple of years ago for young adults on Waiheke Island that was a huge success. So, Debbie.
I actually want to see what I've got up here on the board. So, I want to just say, to begin with, that when Jews talk about a topic, they always go back to the original source. And the original source for us is the Torah. And the Torah for us has a basic premise, or the way we live our lives, is an obsession with justice, the pursuit of justice, and to bring holiness into our lives. So from that point of view, I'm going to use the Torah study that we have here to find out what it says in the text and what the rabbis and our Jewish scholars have extrapolated through history as to the way, the guidelines by which we're supposed to deal with the environment, because it's all there. It's been there for centuries. But as you pointed out in Bereshit, Genesis, chapter 28, is probably the most problematic text that we can find in the Torah. And it says, V'kishvu v'yirdu, subdue and rule over. But yirdu literally means to come down on and to subjugate. And that is extremely problematic, because from that, throughout the generations, people have taken the idea that the Bible is telling us that the resources that are there for us to utilize as we choose. But if we go to the next chapter, in chapter 2, in verse 15, you get to another section which says that the last line there, U l'shamra. Now the Lord took the man and he placed him in the Garden of Eden, paradise, okay? And you're supposed to work it and to guard it. But the word l'shamra is a word only used 3 other times in the Bible. And l'shamra is used in Deuteronomy, and it means that you are an insurer. It's used that you're supposed to guard something. So in other words, I lend you my car, okay? You use it, and you have to return it in the exact same condition you got it in. In other words, you do not have ownership. You are a guardian of that car. You can utilize it. You can develop things with it. You can go around the world in it. But when you return it to me, it better be in the same condition you took it out in. And so l'shamra is telling us the guideline by which we are allowed to, and it's not to push down and use as we will, but it is the way we are allowed to, it's a guideline, the way we are allowed to use those resources. We do not own the earth. We are not owners. We are insurers. We are people who are allowed to utilize it, and when we get done with it and we return it to the owner, and guess who the owner is? Hashem, God. And so when we return it to the owner, it better be in the same condition we started out with it. And the reality is that this concept of ownership and guardianship, which you mentioned earlier, is a vastly different concept. We are guardians. We are insurers of the earth. We are allowed to develop it and be responsible, but we are supposed to return it to the owner in the same viable condition. So, here we go. Then we go on, and it says, and the Lord commanded man, saying, of every tree in the garden you may eat. Etz hagan ochel tochal. So you're allowed to eat of trees. Did it say you're allowed to eat of animals? No, no animals there. The ideal world we're supposed to live in, we are supposed to be eating the fruits and the vegetables. We are not supposed to be killing animals. That comes along 10 generations later in the time of Noah. The flood story, right? So then they say, okay, you're on the boat, you're stuck here, you need some food, it's a dire situation, you can eat meat. Okay? But then we get to Mount Sinai and we receive the Torah. God says, do the deed, and we say, yes, we'll do it. And what happens? He says, okay, you can eat meat because you've already had a taste of this really fine, steak, right? And so he says, I'm going to compromise. You can have steak, but you're only allowed to kill it a certain way. You have to have a consciousness that you're taking a life. You have to be sensitive to the animals of the earth. But ideally, in the 12th century, Maimonides, one of our greatest scholars, says, the ideal, the thing you're supposed to strive to be, is a vegetarian. We get it that you're a fallible human being. We get it that you still want to eat some meat. Okay, so do it kosher. But definitely, the ideal, don't have any illusions. You're supposed to be a vegetarian. And today, we know the proliferation of industrialized meat industry is responsible for some of the most dangerous and prolific greenhouse gases. And so I say, we are the weather. Saving the planet begins at breakfast. Next one. So I expect you to all be vegans tomorrow. No? How many are going vegan tomorrow? Okay. Jewish law of preserving the fruit tree. So I'm just going to go through different parts of the Torah and what it says and some of the things that directly relate. So there's a Jewish law that says we're not allowed to cut down a fruit tree even in time of war. In Judaism, the most important law is preserving human life. You're allowed to desecrate any of the Jewish laws in order to save a life, even cannibalism. And matter of fact, a rabbi in Argentina, when they had the airplane that was shot down in the mountains, anybody know that? And they were in the rabbi actually called the people up who, you're not allowed to kill the guy, but if somebody died, you're allowed to eat the meat in order to save a life. And he said, you did the right thing. Everybody else says it's gross what you did, that you were cannibals, but actually you saved a life. And that was the right thing. So this is a really strange comment, because it says even in war, in time of war, you are not allowed to cut down the fruit tree. And why does that pertain to pikuach nefesh? Because not only are you cutting down the tree to like make your fire and warm yourself up or make your instruments of war, but you are taking food out of the next generation's mouth. And it goes on further, and the rabbis say that the Mishkan, which is so with creation, we went down in Egypt, we got there as slaves, we came out, now we're in the desert, and the first thing God does is says, build the house to pray to God and sacrifice to God. And what would you say? Well, let's take the nicest wood. No. You only take wood of the acacia tree. Why? Because the acacia tree doesn't fruit. And you don't want to cut down a tree that would feed life. Life is sacred, saving a life. You're living in the desert. You aren't even for God's house. You're not allowed to cut down a fruit-bearing tree. Next one. Okay, so God created all of God's creations for the 5 days. After it, God says, and it was good, right? Oh, that's easy. The animals are good, the birds are good, the fishes are good, and the humans come along, and does he say we're good? No, we're not. We are up for grabs. You can choose to be good, or you can choose not to be good. It's in your hands. We are here to work in God's image. We are created in God's image, and we are to work in God's image. But you can make a choice, and you can make the wrong choice. And so whether you are good or not, it is in our hands. And so God's creative process is as if we are now, I wouldn't say the conduits. We aren't God, we are the conduits of God. And so therefore, that goodness is up for grabs, and we are to develop and cultivate the earth by the sweat of our brow. However, when we motzi, when we take out bread from the earth, which is the blessing we say over the bread, which is considered our main meal. When we motzi lechem min haaretz, it is good and it's in our hands. So cultivation is important, changing what we've been given. We are no longer just picking the fruit off the tree, we're actually transforming it and making it into something different and better, bread. But that process can be good if it's in our hands with the right intent and it's not wasteful. In Judaism, we have a thing called midrash. You can take these stories and the rabbis come along and they say, let's make up a little story so you understand it a little bit better. And so this is a midrash. It's not actually written in the Bible or in the Talmud or the Jewish canon of law. It's a story. When God created Adam, he led him around the garden. Behold my works! For your sake did I create it. See to it that you do not spoil or destroy it, for if you destroy it, there will be no one to repair it after you. And that's my message. You know, if we do think that we can utilize this stuff that's been given to us by God, and that we can just use it and walk away, there will be nothing after us. So, the Torah is a license to develop. The Torah, the Jewish book of laws from which our system stems, which is those 5 books of Moses, is not a finished product. It's a guideline. It's a series of laws. We have to figure it out. We have to work with God's creation. We have to develop it. Nature is beautiful. Science and knowledge are incredible. But God gave us this knowledge did not give it to us as a license to destroy. It's a license to improve and develop. Motzi lechem, to take bread, transformative action out of the earth and make it into something better. So the last, and this is probably the clearest directive that's given by the Talmud, which is the body of laws that the rabbis took out of the Torah, and it's called Bal Tashchit. Bal Tashchit, obviously I made little signs there for you all to see so you know. It says that wanton wasting of anything of value at any time is prohibited by laws of Bal Tashchit. So in other words, if you waste anything, it's a transgression of this Bal Tashchit law that we are all required to observe. So food, fuel, paper, energy, and water, these are resources that we often use very casually and wastefully, and they're priced inexpensively, encouraging wasteful consumption. So I think you should all start treating them like gold, and we should price them like gold, because gold actually, we don't really need it. It doesn't have any purpose, frankly speaking. But food, fuel, paper, energy, and water should be priced at the price as the most valuable things on earth, and then people might treat it a bit differently. It's casually priced, it's very problematic, and Bal Tashchit says that the consumption of those things should be dealt with as if they are the most expensive things on earth. And the law says one is forbidden from wasting them. And if you think that there's nothing you can do, all you have to do is look here, over here in this list of food waste. What is the biggest thing on that pie chart? It's consumer wastage. It's 47%. So it starts in your house. I expect every piece of food that's on your plate to go to some use. Other Jewish laws which protect the environment are Shabbat, a day of rest not only for people, but for animals and land. We work 6 days, and on the 7th day we rest. In the time when Judaism came up with this law, it was the most revolutionary thing that ever hit the earth. Everybody worked 7 days a week because they were on the verge of starvation. It was a really different, we go to supermarkets today, we think, not a problem. You get your choice between 20 different cheeses. It's not a question of whether there's enough food. There are people starving, but it's not in our personal reality, and so we don't have that kind of consciousness. But the day of rest is a day off from productivity. I think it's a powerful idea. And that's taken one step further when we go to Shemitah, which is every 7th year the land has to be left fallow. And then we go to the next step even, which is Yuval, which is every 50 years the land returns to the original owners. Now, obviously, this never took place, or the rabbis say it probably didn't take place, because frankly speaking, it would be incredibly problematic to run a society that way, because nobody would make any sales the last 5 years before the 50 year came back, because who wants to pay full price for something that you're going to have to return in 5 years, right? So it was, banking-wise, it was a disaster. And not that they probably had banks then, but you get the basic idea. So, but the concept is really interesting, because it really takes home the idea that we don't personally own this land, that it's not ours to do with as we please. It returns to the original owner, and the original owner is God. Last one. So there's another thing, and it's called Levirate cities. Do you know who the Levites were? So there were the Kohanim, they were the priests. The next one down were the Levites. And when we came into the land of Israel, what they did was they had cities that were established. Originally, were just agricultural people working the land or goat herders. But they established these cities for the people who were taking care of the temple processes. So they weren't working the land. They were living in communities, okay? And these people, the Levite tribe, lived with their houses in the center and the temple, which they were taking care of the sacrifices. And outside of that was a band called a migrash. Migrash literally means like a grassy area. But the migrash, according to Rashi, who was one of the 5th century Jewish commentator, he says that the migrash is an amenity for the beautification of the city, an open area with no buildings, no agriculture, just beauty and recreation area for enjoyment. And after that area, then surrounding it, you can have the agriculture, the industry of the day. In other words, every city surrounding the outside of the housing area and the outside of your security was an area that had no purpose. It wasn't going to make you any food. It wasn't going to defend you. It was just to enjoy God's gift to you, the beauty of the earth. And this, Maimonides says, in the 12th century, teaches that it's not just for the Levirate cities, it's for all cities. Every city, every place, to keep its society sane, needs to have a beautifying area surrounding them. And we know that when we test rats and animals and we put them in a deprived area, they lose control. And the same thing happens in our cities when we put people in really terrible circumstances with no nature around them. They resort to drugs and alcohol and all sorts of things because their life is devoid of meaning. And so it's really important to understand that this is a model for the way we're supposed to live in the earth. And then there's one more after this. The prophet Ezekiel, the prophet was shown a vision, and it's of a polluted ocean, fish and other marine life which are dying. And you're like, wow, this was back then they were talking about these visions? They must have been really able to see into the future. A small trickle of water from under the threshold of the temple, the water symbolizing the Torah or the Jewish law, grows to become a great stream and increases to become a shoreline of beautiful fruit trees. Notice fruit trees, okay? And when these waters finally reach the ocean, that ocean is healed and it is restored to health. Paradise, Gan Eden. We once had it and it can be restored. How? It will happen through the applications and teaching of Torah, which pursues justice, not just for humans, but for the planet. That's one. Spiritual leadership. We know what to do. The real problem is our selfishness, our greediness, and our laziness. We have a moral problem, a spiritual problem, not an intellectual problem. All the solutions for solving the Earth's problems are in our hands today. We know what to do. It is not for lack of knowledge and ingenuity that we do not fix the Earth. It is for our bankrupt morality and spirituality, which does not place a value on fixing our ways of waste and abuse of our planets. It is why a joint spiritual leadership, all of us here today, is one of the keys to saving our planet. So, thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. So I'd like to ask the three speakers to come up, and we will have an opportunity for some questions.
Oh, you want to sit? Okay.
So we've got a couple of microphones that we will just pass around. So who has the first question?
No questions.
Jules.
All three speakers, firstly, thank you so much for wonderful insights and inspiring talks on saving the planet. I've heard that the first step is it's Bible-based, all the Bibles. The second step is spiritual leadership. What's the third step and how do we get there? The third step is how to influence governments. Spiritual leadership will not solve problems. Government leadership will. How do we influence governments?
Who wants to take this question?
I'm happy to say something right here. So I think one of the things about the fact is that we all of our religious communities are across all governments. So if we band together just on a global basis and we do things, then it's a numbers game. The larger you can make your group in influencing government, the more power you have. I think that if we all make it a platform in all of our religious institutions, our numbers will speak for ourselves. We have the largest, as you pointed out, that numbers calculation, we have the largest numbers in the world. We just need to make it our central platform, and then numbers will speak to the governments. Governments listen to numbers. If you have the most money, the most numbers, and the most people, they'll listen to you, and we have the most numbers between the three of us. So I think you're right that we do need to, we just need to be united in that effort.
Yeah, I think I'd back up what Debbie's saying in terms of the numbers. That's kind of the people power thing, right? One of the things that, for example, a number of churches have done recently in Aotearoa is to divest from fossil fuel investments, which in itself, in New Zealand, Christians are relatively, we're a really secular country, right? But that's just a really small kind of gesture towards a much bigger problem. But again, with those numbers, imagine if 5.5 billion people or whatever, or even half that, as I said, did something like divest from fossil fuel investments. That's a really significant gesture. It's a huge message to government agencies and policymakers. And so I think, as Debbie said, I think this is something that we need to work together on, and I think faith leaders need to kind of really take seriously our power, your power, in this situation.
Does that mean that as a group you've stopped using cars that used to?
No, so it's investing in
Just the money?
just, yeah, and that's kind of, it's the first step. Yeah.
Just in a simple addition to what was said, I remember in the part when I was talking about how the human is a guardian of the earth, and before me, Emily said something very similar to that. And then Debbie said something very similar to that, and she actually used the word guardian. So, looking at the similarities, we find that we are similar a lot more than we are different. So if we would capitalize on that and not just take our differences and then split it around, I mean, I think collectively, if we share the same goal, which we do in lots of causes, I think our voice would matter a lot, and that would drive the governments more and in this country especially, it's very easy to convince the government when people are really convinced. So I think it starts by teaching our communities the importance of that, so we can start with our household and get their buy-in as well. So when they are in, they will drive the government to do the mass change. There's a question here? Yeah.
Oh yeah, I was just wondering, how can we be ecologically sound, or whatever the word is, if we don't live like do you know who the Amish people are?
Yeah.
They're people who shun modern stuff. They drive in horse and carts, and they, if we don't live like Amish and they don't use electricity, are they environmentally friendly? They've got animals.
They're hard on the horses.
They're hard on, a lot of animals. But I mean, if they were nice to the animals, it'd be. But I mean, that's what I don't understand, because since the 70s, I've been hearing, we gotta save the environment. And everybody keeps driving cars, flying planes, eating meat by the ton. So what are we gonna, I can hear people, you guys saying something.
So, my initial response was, I think, obviously it needs to be addressed on a whole lot of different levels, individually, kind of societally, government, and so on. But in terms of, most countries, lots of countries in the world have signed up to the Paris Agreement, where we're trying to reduce carbon emissions and also trying to keep the global temperature to 1.5 degrees, hopefully under 2 degrees. And one of the statistics I read recently was that in terms of individual change, it would involve each individual in the world reducing their carbon footprint by 7% a year, which is quite a lot on one level, but actually it's not that much, which might mean, you reduce your meat intake each week, or you drive 2 days a week instead of 5 days a week, or whatever. So there are some really little kind of but significant things that individuals can do, which genuinely make a difference, which would then feed into the much, much broader stream. It's kind of the hummingbird, right? The 7% is the hummingbird.
It's a good story, the hummingbird.
Yeah, and that's kind of, and I think there are little kind of droplets of hope and things that individuals can do to kind of help create a mass movement.
I know some one thing that I used to say the previous generations ruined the world for us. As an old hippie, I used to say that. And now the young people are saying we ruined the world for them. So
I actually totally don't agree with your statement there, which is I believe that. Well, I grew up among the Amish, so I actually know the way they live their lives, but I believe that technology is the solution. I believe that knowledge and science and ingenuity, and we are given this incredible brain and these incredible capabilities. It's just a matter of how we're going to direct that energy. Are we going to direct it to making a bigger profit margin? Or are we going to direct it to making a better green solution for the way we're going to live our lives? Yes, I totally love the hummingbird, and I am a hummingbird. I'm doing those little bits of water and recycling everything and being fanatic, and I feel good about that. but I realize that it's not going to put out the fire. What's going to put out the fire is all of us together as a spiritual unit, leading the world in a path of change. But it's also our incredible ability to problem solve. And all you engineers and mathematicians, that's where your energy has to be directed. And those marketers, you have to teach them to market things differently. We have to sell things differently than we've sold it up to now. We have to sell people the idea that this is going to benefit them and their children, and we're not doing a very good job. We're still selling people that they should consume more.
That's right.
And so the sale has to be different. We have to change the way we market to the world. We have to change how we utilize what we're building and how we make technology. That's what's going to make the difference. It's in our hands. We are totally capable. God gave us these amazing brains. We can utilize technology and have the best world possible, but we have to change the value system that we're selling everybody.
With one thing, I mean, COVID has
turned off the airplanes. That was a good thing.
It's cleaning the sky.
That's right. So you're absolutely right.
You know, because and the ocean as well, because we haven't got these great big cruisers going around and tumbling off people into places that don't want them. Really. But I have a problem, and that is that we've got to treat everybody the same.
Good luck.
And we've got to encourage the places that cannot do anything for themselves. But we are supposed to be we are the guardians. We must be the guardians for try and help these people. And that is a huge, huge ask. But there must be some way, and there will be a way.
The problem is, at least to my knowledge, sorry, I'm terrible here, but the problem is that the Western nations are consuming the vast majority of the resources of the earth. So we think of ourselves as the solution, but the reality is that we're actually the problem. We're the one who's consuming the most stuff. But we also have the capability to change that equation. So I don't actually see us as the models. I actually see the recyclers in Egypt who go through the garbage dumps and pick up the cardboard paper and recycle every single bit of garbage because they're so poor that cardboard is really important in their lifestyles. And those people were given an award, actually, for being the best recyclers in the world. But the reality is that we don't value cardboard in our society. When's the last time you saved a cardboard box instead of had a dresser in your bedroom? I mean, we just don't do that. So it's a different set of values. But poor countries are actually doing a lot more better job of recycling than the rich are.
And I'm sorry to introduce it, but I mean, the Jews and the Arabs in Palestinian is a very sad case. And they have no green space around them or anything anymore. They're not allowed to go into the ocean.
Oh, dear. Okay. This is politics. You made statements there that aren't necessarily true. Yes, the standard of living of Palestinians and their ability to enter Israel is incredibly problematic, but the people who live in Gaza are on the ocean, and they don't have green spaces. That is correct. The people who live in the West Bank do have green spaces. So making a generalization about that is it's not correct information. That by no means am I saying that they don't have problems, but those problems are related to a greater political discussion. And like I say, the people in the Middle East right now are actually it's gonna rewrite the politics of the Middle East is the use of water, because water is gonna become such an incredibly valued resource that it is gonna reconfigure the way everything's done there. You've not seen anything like it. And in Israel today, they had, when I lived there, a massive problem. And what they did was they made huge quantities of desalination plants all across the country. So now they have water. But those desalination plants, ironically enough, run on oil. So it's very problematic. They need to be transferred into a different energy system. But to go back to what you said, you're mixing a political dynamic with a green component. And if you want to talk about it later, I'm more than happy to. It's just not part of this discussion.
The desalinization will lower the sea levels then if everybody desalinizes.
No, the sea level.
Really?
Hi. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts or peer review about the connection with ecology and inequality. Particularly, I think more in Western, I'm going to stick with like New Zealand for just a second. Just the fact that poverty is quite an all-encompassing thing, including how people think about their environment and whether they're able to even dream for a different kind of reality, because they're focused on the next thing, like the next paycheck, the next meal. And so I'm wondering if you've got some thoughts about that connection as well.
I can start since the mic is in my hand. So, as you stated, it's very obvious when we all know that Maslow's hierarchy of needs. When you struggle to fulfill your very basic needs, then you're going to expect someone to care about the environment and how green he should be and how he should use an electric car when he doesn't find water and food, which makes it's a priority in here for us Western countries, but not particularly in all parts of the world. And us knowing that it is priority, we should actually take action. We have the leadership, or we have the ownership in that sense to, one, help them with the basic needs, two, raise awareness about this upper in the pyramid priorities, which is a priority, and we know it's a priority because we have our basic needs satisfied. Not the case with the entire world. So I mean, the question here, when we talk about Palestinian Israel, when there are bigger problems, you don't expect people to think about how green they should be, right?
Yes, it's an intersectional issue, and I don't think we can ignore that. But I also think that so when we talk about climate justice, we also need to be thinking simultaneously about social justice, and you can't really compartmentalize or silo those issues. They have to be kind of addressed together. We know that lower socioeconomic communities are always the first to feel the impacts of climate change. And so absolutely we need to be able to address those multiple issues from multiple different angles. Yes, I think I'll stop there.
Amir,
Yes.
I don't agree with your last statement that you don't, the people who are chasing their basic needs have to be looked after. I don't think that they are the cause of destroying our planet.
Yep.
They are not wasting food because they don't have to. They're not wasting water because they're using water sparingly.
Yep.
And they're certainly not creating air pollution because they don't have cars and they don't have aeroplanes and they don't have all the things that create pollution. What is destroying it is what I think you all three have addressed, those consumers who are wasting. And that's the next level. Those are the people, the middle class, the upper middle class, the rich, who are wasting. And if they would reduce their consumption, that would be very healthy for our planet.
So that's what I think the two-prong approach, which is the religious leaders have the ability to, or they're supposed to be leaders of a set of values in our society, and they have the ability to readjust that set of values. And so that's where the call for all of us comes in, where we can say to our communities, okay, this consumer value system is not a value system we want to pursue. We need to change that. And that's one option. And the other option is that you make it economically beneficial for the capitalist industrial structure to invest in green solutions. So in other words, I think this will happen naturally, and I'm so off topic now, but anyway. I think this will happen naturally because basically nobody's going to be willing to invest in infrastructure that lasts for 25 years that they can't get insured. And no insurer is going to be willing to insure a loan that is going to be for infrastructure that will be obsolete and outlawed when we get to 2 degrees increased in temperature. So I think that the system will actually have to regulate itself because people aren't going to be willing to invest in an infrastructure or a factory that's going to be obsolete that hopefully government's going to legislate against because it's not a good loan to make. That's my theory, for what it's worth.
Thank you. So we'll bring the Q&A to an end, and I'd like to ask Paul Wilton to thank our speakers, please.
Thank you. So before I get on to our speakers, I'd just like to say that I don't think any of us is naive enough to think that we're going to resolve all the world's climate problems in a session like this. But what I do think is incredibly helpful is for us to remind ourselves of something very strong that we have in common, and something that goes to the very heart of our cultures and our teachings, and it goes back many generations for everyone in this room. And you were talking, Emily, about 5.5 billion people of faith. So from the ice in the Antarctic where you started up to the North Pole, we've each spoken about the relationship that exists between God and man and the earth. We've each spoken about the difference between ownership and guardianship. You've all spoken about how thoughtful we have to be. Each one of you gave examples from identification to from suspicion to identification to retrieval. And the examples that you all gave and the level of respect that we owe to our earth in the context of our guardianship. And if 5.5 billion people can get together, as you mentioned, Amr, that in New Zealand, we set a really good example of how people can come together and treat each other with respect and get closer and build relationships and so on. And if we can start working together on all of this, we're just taking some small steps, but the steps are all in the right direction. And this is what's needed for us to come together and to use the force that we have and the influence, and that should be able to make a huge difference in this earth. So thank you to each of you. The children of Abraham are donating 2 trees for each one of you as speakers, and you will be notified. The trees will be planted in somewhere in Auckland, Tamaki Makaurau, and you'll be advised as to what the trees are and where they are and so on. So I sincerely, can they go and visit their trees? Yes, I'd encourage you to find it. And I think it's really appropriate under the circumstances. And for you, Yasir, as well, we're also planting 2 trees for the wonderful work that you've done on behalf of the Pearl of the Island Foundation and for interfaith in general. You're going to be missed, but I know that you're going to a really important role with ethnic affairs. And I'm sure that you're going to be keeping the Pearl of the Island Foundation in your hearts and supporting them as you always have as your family, and also that you'll be there for all of us as well. So I'd like to thank you all for coming this evening, and we have some snacks here. You can have something to eat. And especially thank you to Naomi, who has put this whole evening together.
And I would also like to thank Bill for being outside at our gate and going in and out. And I'm sure he'll be happy to help you out when you're ready to leave. And I'd like to thank people who've brought food and who helped set up. And our speaker here, she also set the whole place up. I walked in and there it was done, and it was like, how did that happen? And thank you, Rob, for drawing our Tico and our YouTube man. Thank you very much for that. And I just want to draw your attention to up here, in case you've been looking at it and wondering, thinking about it. What do you think it represents? Creation?
No. Creation.
Yeah, a little bit more than that. People. Food. It actually represents the 5 books of Moses, starting with Genesis at the beginning and ending with Deuteronomy. There are 5 panels. It was done by Don Copeland, who's an Auckland artist. So I thought as we're the children of Abraham, it was a very pertinent piece of art to draw to your attention. So we'd like you to stay for supper and enjoy having a good schmooze with each other as well. Thank you very much for coming.